What if I told you that the most feared institution in medieval Europe, an organization that tortured thousands in the name of God, was secretly terrified of something far more dangerous than heresy? What if the Spanish Inquisition, with all its power and ruthless efficiency, trembled before a threat that could spread faster than wildfire and transform devout Christians into ravenous beasts under the light of the full moon? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Deep within the archives of the Vatican's secret library, buried beneath centuries of dust and sealed with papal authority, lies a collection of documents that the Catholic Church has never wanted the world to see. These are the classified reports of the Inquisition's most secretive branch, the Officium Lycanthropia, an elite unit tasked with hunting down and eliminating what they called the Lycanthropy Virus. Not werewolves, as we imagine them in Hollywood films, but something far more insidious, a supernatural plague that could turn entire villages into packs of bloodthirsty monsters. Tonight, we're going to uncover the terrifying truth about how the Inquisition discovered this ancient curse, why they believed it posed a greater threat to Christendom than any heretical movement, and the brutal methods they used to contain what they saw as Satan's own biological weapon. This isn't the sanitized version of history you learned in school. This is the story of holy men who became monsters in their quest to stop monsters, and the dark secret that nearly brought down the most powerful religious institution in the world. But first, let me set the scene for you, because understanding the lycanthropy crisis requires understanding the world that created it. Picture Europe in the year 1484. The Black Death had ravaged the continent just over a century earlier, killing 1/3 of the population and leaving entire regions depopulated and wild. In these abandoned territories where civilization had retreated and nature reclaimed its dominion, something ancient began to stir. The old gods, the pagan spirits that Christianity had tried so hard to bury, found fertile ground in the fears and desperation of survivors. It was in these borderlands between the civilized and the savage that the first reports began to surface. Travelers spoke of villages where the church bells fell silent, where no smoke rose from chimneys, and where the only sounds in the night were howls that seemed almost human. Initially, the church dismissed these accounts as the ravings of superstitious peasants. After all, wolves were a common threat in medieval Europe, and fear had a way of transforming ordinary predators into supernatural terrors. But then came the testimony of Brother Matthias of Würzburg, a Franciscan monk whose credibility was beyond reproach. In the summer of 1484, Brother Matthias was traveling through the Bavarian forest when he witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As he recorded in his journal, which I'll quote directly from the Vatican archives, he saw what appeared to be a group of pilgrims gathered around a campfire. But as the moon rose full and bright above the tree line, these seemingly devout Christians underwent a transformation so horrific that Matthias initially believed he was witnessing a mass demonic possession. Their bodies contorted and stretched, their faces elongated into snouts filled with razor-sharp teeth, and their hands became claws capable of tearing through chainmail. But here's what made this account different from typical werewolf stories. These creatures retained their human intelligence. They spoke to each other in corrupted Latin, organized themselves into hunting parties, and most chillingly of all, they seemed to be actively seeking out other Christians to infect with their curse. Brother Matthias watched in horror as this pack systematically hunted down a group of merchants who had made camp nearby. But instead of simply killing their victims, the creatures bit each one precisely on the neck, then retreated into the forest. The merchants, thinking they had survived a wolf attack, continued their journey. What they didn't realize was that they were now carriers of something far worse than any natural disease. Within 3 days, these infected merchants had reached the trading town of Bamberg. Within a week, the lycanthropy virus had spread to over 50 people. Within a month, the entire region was under quarantine as reports poured in of whole families transforming during the full moon and terrorizing the countryside. This was when Pope Innocent made the decision that would define the Church's secret war against lycanthropy for the next 2 centuries. Rather than treat this as a simple outbreak of demonic possession, something that local priests could handle with prayer and holy water, the Pope recognized that they were dealing with a contagious supernatural plague that threatened the very foundation of Christian civilization. The papal bull that established the Officium Lycanthropia was never made public. In fact, its existence was known only to a select circle of cardinals and the most trusted inquisitors. The document, which I've had the privilege of examining in the Vatican archives, describes lycanthropy not as a curse or a form of demonic possession, but as a virus. This was revolutionary thinking for the 15th century, predating our modern understanding of infectious diseases by centuries. According to the Church's secret doctrine, lycanthropy was Satan's attempt to create his own twisted version of the Eucharist, just as Christ's blood could transform the faithful into members of his mystical body. The lycanthropy virus could transform Christians into members of Satan's bestial army. The bite of an infected individual didn't just wound the flesh, it corrupted the soul, creating a blasphemous communion between the victim and the forces of darkness. What made this threat so terrifying to Church authorities wasn't just its supernatural nature, but its method of transmission. Unlike traditional forms of demonic possession, which typically affected isolated individuals, lycanthropy spread through communities like wildfire. Worse still, the infected often appeared normal during the weeks between full moons, making them perfect sleeper agents who could infiltrate Christian society undetected. The Officium Lycanthropia developed a sophisticated understanding of how the virus operated. Their field reports, written in a cipher that wasn't decoded until the 20th century, describe a 3-stage infection process that reads like something from a modern medical textbook, albeit one written by medieval theologians with a supernatural worldview. Stage 1 was the incubation period, lasting from the initial bite until the first full moon. During this time, the infected individual would experience subtle changes: enhanced night vision, increased aggression, an aversion to holy symbols, and most tellingly, an irresistible craving for raw meat. Experienced inquisitors learned to identify these early symptoms, often conducting surprise inspections of suspected individuals by presenting them with consecrated hosts or holy relics. Stage 2 occurred during the first transformation under the full moon. This was when the virus fully activated, reshaping not just the victim's body, but their fundamental nature. The Inquisition's reports describe this transformation in clinical detail, noting how the skeletal structure would elongate, the muscle mass would increase dramatically, and the nervous system would be rewired to enhance predatory instincts while suppressing human empathy and reason. But it was stage 3 that truly terrified the church authorities. After the first transformation, the infected individual would retain some of their enhanced abilities, even in human form. They became stronger, faster, and more resilient than normal humans. Their senses were dramatically heightened, allowing them to detect other supernatural entities, including vampires and demons, making them formidable opponents even for trained inquisitors. More disturbing still was the psychological transformation that accompanied the physical changes. The infected didn't just become monsters during the full moon, they became willing servants of a larger supernatural conspiracy. The Inquisition's investigators discovered that lycanthropes could communicate with each other across vast distances through methods that seemed to transcend normal human senses. They formed packs that operated with military precision, coordinated their attacks across multiple regions, and most alarmingly, began actively seeking out positions of influence within Christian society. The Church's response was swift and merciless. Pope Innocent VIII authorized the use of any means necessary to contain the lycanthropy outbreak, including methods that went far beyond the traditional tools of the Inquisition. Special weapons were blessed by teams of bishops. Silver was consecrated using relics of martyred saints, and entire arsenals of anti-lycanthrope equipment were distributed to inquisitors across Europe. But conventional weapons, even blessed ones, proved inadequate against the lycanthropy virus. The infected could survive wounds that would kill normal humans. They healed at an accelerated rate, and their pack mentality made them incredibly difficult to isolate and eliminate. The Inquisition needed new tactics, and they needed them quickly. This led to the development of what the Church called preemptive purification, a euphemism for the systematic elimination of entire communities suspected of harboring lycanthropes. Unlike traditional Inquisition trials, which at least maintained the pretense of seeking confession and redemption, the anti-lycanthropy operations were purely military in nature. Suspected infected areas were surrounded, isolated, and then purged with fire and blessed silver. The scale of these operations was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 10,000 people were killed during the first decade of the Officium Lycanthropia's existence, often entire villages at a time. The official records describe these massacres as necessary sacrifices to prevent the corruption of all Christendom, but the private correspondence of the inquisitors tells a different story. Many of the men tasked with carrying out these operations were haunted by what they had done. Father Diego de Mendoza, one of the most effective lycanthrope hunters of the late 15th century, wrote in his personal diary that he could no longer distinguish between the monsters he was hunting and the monster he had become. His final entry, written just before he took his own life, reads, "In seeking to preserve the humanity of others, I have lost my own. God forgive us all for what we have done in His name." The psychological toll on the inquisitors was compounded by the growing realization that their war against lycanthropy was far from won. Despite their brutal methods, new outbreaks continued to appear across Europe, often in regions that had already been cleansed. The virus seemed to adapt to their countermeasures. developing new methods of transmission and new ways to avoid detection. By 1490, just 6 years after the establishment of the Officium Lycanthropia, the Church was facing a crisis that threatened to expose their secret war to the general population. The massive loss of life in rural communities was becoming impossible to explain away as natural disasters or ordinary plague outbreaks. Worse still, rumors were beginning to spread about the Church's involvement in these mysterious disappearances. It was at this critical juncture that the Inquisition made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden within the confession of a captured lycanthrope was information that revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. The Lycanthropy Virus wasn't a random supernatural plague that had emerged from the wilderness. It was a weapon deliberately created and deployed by an ancient enemy of the Church, an organization that had been planning this assault on Christendom for centuries. The implications of this revelation were staggering, and they would force the Inquisition to confront an enemy far more dangerous and sophisticated than they had ever imagined. But that's a story that requires us to delve deeper into the darkest secrets of the Vatican archives. Secrets that some within the Church believe should never see the light of day. The confession came from a lycanthrope known only as Marcus the Apostate, a former Benedictine monk who had been captured during a raid on a monastery near Lyon. What made Marcus different from other infected individuals wasn't just his retained intelligence, but his willingness to speak. Most lycanthropes, even when tortured, would only howl and snarl. Marcus spoke in perfect ecclesiastical Latin, quoted scripture with disturbing accuracy, and worst of all, he seemed to find genuine amusement in the Inquisitors' growing desperation. During his interrogation, which lasted 3 weeks and employed methods that even hardened Inquisitors found difficult to stomach, Marcus revealed that the lycanthropy outbreak was orchestrated by a secret society known as the Lupus Covenant. This wasn't a collection of devil worshippers or pagan cultists, as the Church had assumed. It was an organization of former Christians, many of them ex-clergy, who had deliberately sought out lycanthropic infection as a means of gaining the power to destroy the Church from within. The Lupus Covenant had been planning their assault for over 2 centuries, carefully studying Church doctrine, infiltrating monasteries, and identifying the exact theological weaknesses they could exploit. They understood that the Church's greatest strength was its unity, its ability to present a single, unshakable front against all enemies. But they also recognized that this unity was fragile, dependent on faith in the Church's moral authority and divine protection. What better way to shatter that faith than to demonstrate that God's own servants could be transformed into monsters? The Covenant's strategy was diabolically simple. Infect key Church officials during the full moon, then reveal their transformations to the faithful at the moment of maximum psychological impact. Imagine the horror of witnessing your beloved parish priest sprouting fangs and claws during Sunday Mass. Imagine the terror of discovering that your confessor had been listening to your sins with the ears of a beast. Marcus described the Covenant's organizational structure with the precision of a military strategist. At its head was a figure known only as the Alpha, a lycanthrope so ancient and powerful that he could transform at will, regardless of lunar cycles. Beneath him were the pack leaders, infected individuals who had retained enough of their human intelligence to coordinate complex operations while gaining the enhanced physical abilities of their cursed state. The Covenant operated through a network of cells scattered across Europe, each one containing between 5 and 12 members. They communicated through a combination of coded messages and supernatural means that the Inquisition never fully understood. Most disturbing of all, they had been systematically recruiting from within the church itself, targeting priests, monks, and nuns who had become disillusioned with their faith or who harbored secret resentments against the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Father Alessandro Toretti, the lead inquisitor assigned to Marcus's case, wrote in his confidential report to Rome that the Covenant represented an existential threat, unlike any the Church had faced since its founding. Unlike external enemies, such as Muslim armies or Viking raiders, the Lupus Covenant attacked Christianity from within, corrupting the very individuals entrusted with preserving and spreading the faith. But Marcus's revelations contained an even more terrifying truth. The lycanthropy virus wasn't just spreading randomly through bite transmission. The Covenant had developed methods of deliberately infecting specific targets through contaminated communion wine, blessed oils that had been secretly corrupted, and even holy relics that had been exposed to lycanthropic blood during dark rituals performed at the stroke of midnight. This meant that any Christian who participated in religious ceremonies could potentially be infected without their knowledge. The very sacraments that were supposed to protect the faithful had been weaponized against them. The implications were staggering. If the Church admitted that their own religious practices could transmit supernatural corruption, it would undermine the foundation of Christian worship itself. The Inquisition found itself caught in an impossible position. They needed to warn church officials about the threat, but they couldn't do so without risking widespread panic that could destroy the faith of millions. They needed to investigate potential infections within their own ranks, but they couldn't do so without admitting that the church's spiritual defenses had been compromised. Pope Innocent VIII's solution was characteristically ruthless. Rather than risk exposing the crisis to the general population, he authorized the creation of the Silent Purification, a program designed to eliminate suspected Covenant members through methods that would appear to be natural deaths or accidents. Poisonings disguised as illnesses, falls from monastery towers during the night, disappearances during pilgrimages to remote shrines. The silent purification required the Inquisition to develop new skills that went far beyond their traditional methods of interrogation and execution. They became assassins, spies, and masters of deception. They learned to kill silently and efficiently, leaving no trace of their involvement. They infiltrated the very communities they were supposed to protect, watching for signs of infection and eliminating threats before they could spread. Brother Francesco de Rimini, one of the most effective silent purification operatives, left behind a coded journal that reveals the psychological cost of this secret war. He describes conducting surveillance on fellow priests, poisoning communion wine intended for suspected lycanthropes, and staging accidents that claimed the lives of men he had known and served alongside for years. In one particularly haunting entry, Francesco writes about having to eliminate Father Thomas, his former confessor and spiritual mentor, after discovering evidence of lycanthropic infection. Francesco watched Thomas transform during a clandestine full moon ceremony, confirming his worst fears. The next morning, he placed a blessed silver blade between Thomas's ribs, while the priest knelt in prayer, making it appear as though he had suffered a sudden heart attack. "I have become death itself," Francesco wrote, "a pale rider sent to harvest souls in God's name. But as I watched Thomas die, I wondered if the monster I killed was any worse than the monster I have become. We tell ourselves we preserve the faith by destroying the faithful. But what faith remains when it is built upon such foundations of blood and deception?" The silent purification achieved its immediate goals. Covenant cells across Europe were systematically eliminated, often before they fully understood they were under attack. The Inquisition's new methods were so effective that many lycanthropes began to suspect, leading to internal conflicts that further weakened their own pack members of betrayal, organization. But the psychological toll on the Inquisitors was devastating. Many of the men involved in these operations suffered from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. They experienced nightmares, hallucinations, and periods of uncontrollable rage that seemed to mirror the symptoms they were fighting to eliminate. Some began to wonder if exposure to lycanthropic corruption was somehow affecting them as well, transforming them into monsters of a different sort. Father Miguel de Cervantes, not to be confused with the famous author, was tasked with monitoring the mental health of silent purification operatives. His confidential reports to the Vatican describe a pattern of psychological deterioration that seemed to accelerate with each successful mission. The men were becoming increasingly paranoid, violent, and detached from normal human emotion. Most troubling of all were the reports of inquisitors who claimed to be experiencing enhanced physical abilities, similar to those described in lycanthrope cases, increased strength, heightened senses, and an unusual resistance to injury. Father Cervantes theorized that prolonged exposure to lycanthropic corruption might be causing some form of psychological contagion, even in individuals who had never been physically infected. The situation reached a crisis point in 1493 when 3 silent purification operatives went rogue, abandoning their posts and disappearing into the wilderness of the Pyrenees Mountains. Search parties sent to locate them discovered evidence of brutal attacks on local villages, with bite marks and claw wounds that matched those associated with lycanthrope activity. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Inquisition faced the horrifying possibility that their own methods were creating the very monsters they were trying to eliminate. It was at this moment of maximum crisis that the Church received an unexpected offer of assistance from a source that would change everything. A letter arrived at the Vatican, written in an archaic form of Latin that predated the fall of Rome, claiming to be from an organization that had been fighting lycanthropes for over 1,000 years. They called themselves the Order of the Silver Dawn, and they possessed knowledge and weapons that could turn the tide in the Church's favor. But their help would come at a price that would force the Inquisition to confront the darkest aspects of their own nature and to make alliances that would challenge everything they believed about the nature of good and evil in the supernatural world. The letter from the Order of the Silver Dawn arrived at the Vatican wrapped in a cloth that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light, sealed with wax that bore the imprint of a crescent moon pierced by a silver sword. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI, was among the first to examine this mysterious correspondence. His private notes, discovered centuries later hidden within the walls of his chambers, revealed a mixture of hope and trepidation that gripped the Church's highest officials. The Order claimed to have been founded during the reign of Charlemagne, established by a group of warrior monks who had encountered lycanthropic creatures during the conquest of Saxon territories. According to their letter, they had spent the intervening centuries perfecting methods of detection, containment, and elimination that went far beyond anything the Inquisition had developed. They possessed weapons forged from silver blessed under specific celestial alignments, protective rituals that could shield entire communities from infection, and most intriguingly, a process they called purification through flame that could allegedly cure lycanthropy in its early stages. But the Order's offer came with conditions that made even hardened inquisitors uncomfortable. They demanded complete autonomy in their operations, access to all church records regarding supernatural threats, and perhaps, most disturbing of all, the right to recruit from within the church's own ranks without interference from ecclesiastical authorities. They claimed that their methods required individuals with specific spiritual and physical characteristics that could only be found among those who had dedicated their lives to serving God. The negotiations between the Vatican and the Order of the Silver Dawn took place in absolute secrecy, conducted through a series of coded messages and clandestine meetings in remote monasteries across Europe. Father Antonio Grimaldi, chosen as the church's primary liaison due to his expertise in both theology and military strategy, left behind detailed accounts of these discussions that read more like diplomatic treaties between warring nations than conversations between fellow Christians. The Order's representatives were unlike any religious figures the church had encountered. They moved with the fluid grace of trained warriors, spoke in whispers that somehow carried clearly across vast chambers, and possessed an uncanny ability to appear and disappear without anyone noticing their arrival or departure. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to know details about the lycanthropy crisis that the church had never shared with anyone outside their inner circle. Brother Aldrich, the Order's primary spokesman, explained that their organization had been monitoring the Covenant's activities for decades. They had observed the systematic infiltration of church hierarchies, documented the development of new infection methods, and most crucially, identified the location of what they called the Prime Den, the central stronghold from which the Alpha coordinated all Covenant operations. The Prime Den was hidden deep within the Carpathian Mountains, in a region so remote and treacherous that even local hunters avoided it. According to the Order's intelligence, it was there that the Alpha had established a grotesque parody of a monastery, complete with corrupted religious ceremonies that transformed volunteers into lycanthropes through ritualistic infection. The facility served multiple purposes: training center for new pack members, laboratory for developing enhanced strains of the virus, and command center for coordinating attacks across Europe. Brother Aldrich's descriptions of the Prime Den were so detailed that church officials initially suspected the Order might be working with the Covenant. He described underground chambers carved from living rock, illuminated by torches that burned with an unnatural blue flame. He spoke of corrupted altars, where human blood was mixed with lycanthropic saliva to create new variants of the infection. Most horrifyingly, he detailed breeding programs designed to create lycanthropes who could transform regardless of lunar cycles, creating an army of super predators that could strike at any time. The Order claimed to have infiltrated the Prime Den on multiple occasions, gathering intelligence and sabotaging Covenant operations when possible. but they insisted that a full assault on the facility would require resources and manpower that exceeded their capabilities. They needed the church's support, not just in terms of funding and equipment, but in terms of spiritual authority that could provide protection against the supernatural defenses that surrounded the Alpha's stronghold. Father Grimaldi's reports revealed the intense debates that raged within the Vatican's highest councils. Some cardinals argued that allying with an unknown organization was too dangerous, that the Church should continue developing its own methods of fighting lycanthropy. Others pointed out that the silent purification had already compromised the Church's moral authority, and that further delays would only allow the covenant to grow stronger. The deciding factor came in the form of another outbreak, this one in the heart of Rome itself. 3 cardinals were discovered to have been infected, their transformations occurring during a private meeting in the Apostolic Palace. The incident was contained, but barely was clear. The covenant had bayonet prelates in Han of a dozen fighting the transform, and only through the sacrifice, Swiss guards who died to hand combat. The message rated to the very heart of the Church, and traditional methods were no longer sufficient. Pope Innocent authorized the alliance with the Order of the Silver Dawn in a secret papal bull that was never recorded in official church documents. The agreement granted the order unprecedented authority to operate within church territories, access to sacred relics and blessed materials, and most significantly, permission to recruit from among the church's most elite warriors and scholars. The recruitment process was unlike anything the church had previously authorized. The order's representatives conducted interviews that seemed to probe not just the candidates' faith and fighting ability, but aspects of their personality that bordered on the supernatural. They asked questions about dreams, about moments of unusual strength or insight, about family histories that often reached back generations. Many qualified candidates were rejected for reasons that were never explained, while others who seemed unsuitable were eagerly accepted. Brother Thomas de Montfort, a Templar knight who was among the first to be recruited, described the selection process in letters to his sister that were discovered in a Bavarian monastery. He wrote of tests that challenged not just physical prowess, but spiritual endurance, including exposure to what appeared to be actual lycanthropic corruption in controlled conditions. The order claimed these tests were necessary to identify individuals who possessed natural resistance to infection, but the procedures pushed many candidates to the brink of madness. Those who survived the selection process underwent training that transformed them into something altogether different from traditional inquisitors. They learned to fight with blessed silver weapons that seemed to respond to their will, to move through darkness with supernatural stealth, and to resist mental influences that would shatter ordinary minds. Most remarkably, they developed an ability to sense lycanthropic corruption from considerable distances, often detecting infected individuals days before any physical symptoms appeared. The order called these enhanced warriors the Argent Sentinels, and they proved devastatingly effective against Covenant operations. Unlike the silent purification operatives who relied on stealth and deception, the Sentinels fought openly, engaging lycanthropes in direct combat with weapons and techniques specifically designed to exploit their supernatural weaknesses. Their success rate was extraordinary, but so was the cost to their humanity. Father Ricardo Montoya, assigned to monitor the Sentinels' spiritual well-being, filed increasingly disturbing reports about their psychological state. The enhanced warriors displayed symptoms that seemed to mirror those of the lycanthropes they fought. Heightened aggression, pack-like loyalty to their fellow sentinels, and an increasing disconnection from normal human emotions. Most troubling were reports that some sentinels had been observed exhibiting enhanced physical abilities during times when no supernatural influences should have been present. The Order dismissed these concerns, claiming that temporary side effects were inevitable in any process that required such intimate contact with supernatural forces. They insisted that the Sentinels' enhanced abilities were gifts from God, divine blessings granted to those pure enough in faith to resist corruption while gaining the strength needed to fight it. But private communications between Order leaders, intercepted by church spies, told a different story. These intercepted messages revealed that the Order had been conducting experiments on their own members for centuries, deliberately exposing them to various forms of supernatural influence in order to create warriors capable of fighting monsters on equal terms. The process was dangerous and often fatal, but those who survived emerged with abilities that bordered on the miraculous. The Order had essentially created their own form of controlled supernatural infection, one that enhanced rather than corrupted human capabilities. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the Vatican hierarchy. The Church found itself allied with an organization that was using methods almost indistinguishable from those employed by their enemies. The Sentinels were no longer entirely human, just as lycanthropes were no longer entirely human. The line between salvation and damnation had become so blurred that even the most learned theologians struggled to determine which side was truly serving God's will. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who would later become Pope Paul III, wrote in his private correspondence that the Church faced an impossible choice. They could continue their alliance with the Order and risk becoming the very monsters they sought to destroy, or they could abandon the alliance and face almost certain defeat at the hands of the Covenant. Either path led to damnation, either of the body or of the soul. The crisis deepened when intelligence reports confirmed that the Alpha had begun recruiting from among captured Sentinels, using techniques developed by the Order against its own enhanced warriors. Several missing Sentinels were discovered leading Covenant attacks, their silver weapons turned against their former allies, their enhanced abilities now serving the enemy they had sworn to destroy. The war between the Church and the lycanthropes had become a conflict between two groups of supernatural soldiers, with ordinary humanity caught in the crossfire. It was at this moment of maximum desperation that the Order revealed the true scope of their plan to assault the Prime Den. The operation would require not just the Church's remaining Sentinels, but the participation of other supernatural entities that the Order claimed to have contacted. They spoke of alliances with vampire covens who saw lycanthropes as competitors for human prey, of negotiations with demonic entities who opposed the Covenant's influence in mortal affairs, and most shocking of all, of pacts with beings they described as angels who had chosen to intervene directly in human affairs. The proposed assault on the Prime Den would bring together the strangest collection of allies in the history of supernatural warfare. Inquisitors armed with holy relics, enhanced warriors wielding blessed silver, vampires seeking to eliminate rivals, demons pursuing their own mysterious agendas, and celestial beings whose motives remained incomprehensible to mortal minds. It was an alliance that violated every principle of Christian theology. Yet, it represented the only hope of stopping the lycanthropy virus before it could spread beyond the point of containment. Pope Innocent VIII faced the most difficult decision of his papacy. He could authorize an operation that would require the Church to ally with the very forces of darkness it had spent centuries fighting. Or he could accept the inevitable triumph of the Covenant and the transformation of Christian Europe into a realm ruled by lycanthropic pack leaders. The choice he made would determine not just the fate of his church, but the future of human civilization itself. The papal decision came in the form of a document so classified that only 3 copies were ever made, each one secured with seals that would dissolve if tampered with by unauthorized hands. The operation was given the code name Lupus Ultimatum, and its authorization marked the beginning of the most dangerous and morally compromising mission in the Church's history. The preparations for Lupus Ultimatum began in the winter of 1494, conducted in absolute secrecy within the deepest vaults of Castel Sant'Angelo. Brother Aldrich and his order representatives worked alongside Vatican officials to coordinate what would become the most ambitious supernatural military operation in recorded history. The logistics alone were staggering, requiring the transport of blessed weapons, consecrated supplies, and most challenging of all, the coordination of allies whose very presence in the same location threatened to tear apart the fabric of reality itself. Father Grimaldi's encrypted journals describe the surreal nature of these planning sessions. In one chamber, inquisitors would be reviewing maps and battle strategies with their traditional methods of prayer and holy water. In an adjacent room, vampire representatives would be discussing their own tactical preferences, while carefully avoiding any exposure to the blessed materials that filled the fortress. Meanwhile, demonic entities communicated through intermediaries who had to be rotated frequently to prevent their minds from being permanently damaged by prolonged exposure to infernal influence. The order insisted that each faction would need to contribute specific capabilities that no other group possessed. The Church would provide spiritual authority and weapons blessed with divine power. The vampires would offer supernatural stealth and the ability to move through the Carpathian wilderness without detection. The demonic allies would contribute knowledge of the dark rituals that protected the Prime Den, along with the ability to disrupt the supernatural defenses that surrounded it. Most controversial of all were the celestial beings whose participation the Order claimed to have secured. These entities refused to communicate directly with Church officials, instead sending messages through dreams and visions that left their recipients barely coherent for days afterward. The few comprehensible communications suggested that these beings viewed the lycanthropy crisis as a violation of cosmic law that threatened the balance between order and chaos throughout the mortal realm. Cardinal Borgia's private notes reveal his growing unease with the nature of these alliances. He wrote extensively about the theological implications of working alongside vampires and demons, questioning whether victory achieved through such means could ever be considered righteous. His correspondence with other church officials shows a man wrestling with the possibility that the cure for lycanthropy might prove worse than the disease itself. The recruitment of additional sentinels for the operation required the order to expand their selection criteria beyond the church's traditional warrior orders. They began approaching scholars, artisans, and even merchants who displayed the mysterious qualities they sought. Brother Francesco di Milano, a manuscript illuminator with no military experience, found himself selected for training after demonstrating an unusual ability to detect supernatural influences in ancient texts. The training regimens developed for Lupus Ultimatum pushed human endurance beyond anything previously attempted. Candidates were exposed to increasingly intense forms of supernatural corruption under controlled conditions, building up their resistance while enhancing their natural abilities. The mortality rate during training was over 30%, but those who survived emerged transformed in ways that even experienced inquisitors found difficult to comprehend. Father Montoya's reports on the psychological state of these new sentinels painted a troubling picture. Many displayed behavior patterns that seemed to mirror those of their supernatural allies rather than their human origins. They moved with the predatory grace of vampires, spoke in whispers that carried supernatural authority, and demonstrated an unsettling indifference to conventional moral constraints. The line between enhancement and corruption had become so blurred that determining which side of it the sentinels occupied required theological debates that lasted for weeks. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from Order operatives near the Prime Den indicated that the Alpha had become aware of the preparations being made against him. Covenant forces across Europe began consolidating their positions, abandoning smaller operations in favor of fortifying their central stronghold. Most disturbing were reports of new lycanthrope variants emerging from the Prime Den, creatures that displayed capabilities far beyond anything previously documented. These enhanced lycanthropes could apparently transform at will regardless of lunar phases, maintained their human intelligence while in beast form, and demonstrated resistance to traditional weaknesses, including silver and blessed weapons. Brother Aldrich's intelligence network reported sightings of lycanthropes who could fly, others who seemed to phase in and out of physical reality, and most terrifyingly, pack leaders who could apparently infect multiple victims simultaneously through some form of supernatural emanation rather than physical contact. The Alpha himself remained an enigma that grew more disturbing with each intelligence report. Descriptions of him varied so wildly that investigators began to suspect he might possess shape-shifting abilities that extended far beyond typical lycanthropic transformation. Some accounts described him as a massive wolf-like creature with intelligence that burned like fire in his eyes. Others spoke of a pale, aristocratic figure who moved with inhuman grace and spoke in a voice that could compel obedience from anyone who heard it. Most unsettling were reports suggesting that the Alpha had begun attempting to corrupt members of the Order itself. Several sentinels on reconnaissance missions reported dreams in which a compelling voice offered them power beyond imagination in exchange for abandoning their mission. These psychological attacks seemed specifically designed to exploit the enhanced warriors' existing supernatural enhancements, turning their greatest strengths into potential vulnerabilities. The Order's response to these developments was characteristically ruthless. They implemented new protocols, requiring sentinels to undergo daily spiritual examinations designed to detect even the slightest signs of corrupted influence. Those who showed any suspicious symptoms were immediately quarantined and subjected to purification rituals that often proved as dangerous as the corruption they were meant to eliminate. Brother Thomas de Montfort's letters during this period describe the growing paranoia within the sentinel ranks. Warriors who had fought alongside each other for months began viewing their comrades with suspicion, watching for signs that the Alpha's influence had taken root. The psychological pressure was so intense that several sentinels suffered complete mental breakdowns, requiring them to be sedated with blessed compounds and removed from active duty. The supernatural allies presented their own unique challenges. The vampire representatives demanded that all meetings take place during nighttime hours and insisted on feeding schedules that the church found morally reprehensible. The demonic entities required elaborate containment protocols to prevent them from influencing nearby humans, while their communications had to be filtered through specially trained intermediaries to avoid driving church officials insane. Most problematic were the celestial beings, whose participation remained essential, but whose methods of communication grew increasingly erratic as the planned assault date approached. Their messages began arriving through multiple channels simultaneously, creating contradictory instructions that left operational planners struggling to determine which guidance was authentic and which might be attempts at sabotage by enemy forces. The final intelligence briefings before Lupus Ultimatum revealed the full scope of what the assault teams would face at the Prime Den. The facility was apparently far larger than initial estimates had suggested, extending deep into the mountain through a network of natural caves and artificially expanded chambers. The Alpha had been using captured architects and engineers to create a fortress that combined medieval defensive principles with supernatural enhancements that made conventional siege tactics useless. The outer perimeter was protected by lycanthrope sentries who could detect approaching enemies from miles away. The mountain approaches were guarded by creatures that had been so extensively modified that they barely resembled their original human forms. Most challenging of all, the entire facility was surrounded by what Order intelligence described as a corruption field that would gradually infect anyone who remained in the area for more than a few hours. Father Grimaldi's final strategic assessment painted a grim picture of their chances for success. Even with their supernatural allies, the assault force would be vastly outnumbered by defenders who knew the terrain intimately and possessed home field advantages that included environmental hazards specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of each type of attacker. The vampires would face chambers flooded with blessed light that would weaken them severely. The demonic allies would encounter consecrated barriers that would limit their mobility and supernatural abilities. Even the sentinels would find their enhanced capabilities partially suppressed by the corruption field that surrounded the entire facility. Yet despite these overwhelming obstacles, the operation proceeded as planned. Pope Innocent V had made his decision, and the fought tested in the hands of Christian Europe, now our strangest military alliance in human history. As the assault teams began their final preparations for the journey to the Carpathian Mountains, none of them could have anticipated the discoveries waiting for them in the depths of the Prime Den. Revelations that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about the nature of good and evil in the supernatural world. The departure for the Prime Den took place on the night of the new moon, when darkness would provide maximum cover for the diverse assault force. The logistics of moving such an unusual army across Europe without detection required careful coordination with church officials throughout the continent, many of whom had no knowledge of the true nature of the mission they were supporting. The sentinels traveled openly as a group of warrior pilgrims bound for Jerusalem, their blessed weapons concealed as religious artifacts and ceremonial items. The vampire contingent moved separately through underground networks that had been established centuries earlier for their own purposes, emerging only at predetermined rendezvous points along the route. The demonic entities required the most complex transportation arrangements, moving through pathways that existed partially outside normal reality and required constant monitoring to prevent them from accidentally manifesting in populated areas. The files sealed in the Vatican archives remain locked away to this day, their contents too dangerous for the world to know. Whether Lupus' ultimatum succeeded or failed, whether the Alpha was destroyed or escaped to spread his corruption elsewhere, these secrets died with the men who carried them into those Carpathian caves. But perhaps the most chilling truth isn't what happened in that mountain stronghold, but what it reveals about the nature of power itself. The Inquisition's war against lycanthropy transformed them into the very monsters they sought to destroy, proving that sometimes the greatest threats to humanity come not from supernatural predators lurking in the darkness, but from those who claim to protect us from them. The next time you hear stories of holy warriors and righteous crusades, remember the Officium Lycanthropia and ask yourself, when does the cure become worse than the disease?